The front gate was open, not cracked, not ajar. Wide open, like nobody expected anyone to care enough to close it. Selim Dreven stepped out of the black SUV and didn't move. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. He just stood there looking at that gate while the Atlantic wind drove straight through his jacket like it had somewhere important to be. Salt in the air. Cold stone under his shoes. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel like peace. Feels like warning. He hadn't called ahead. That was the entire point. 5 years of running an empire that never slept. And tonight, just tonight, he wanted to walk through his own front door without the house rearranging itself around him first. No advanced security sweep. No staff lining the hallway pretending they weren't nervous. No husband standing at the entrance with that careful, composed expression. Selim had learned to read the way other men read weather. Just Soren. Unguarded. Real. That was the plan. The open gate was not the plan. Hi viewers. Have you ever walked into a situation expecting one thing, and your gut told you something was wrong before your brain even caught up? Drop a yes or no in the comments right now. He moved up the stone path without rushing. Quiet steps on the pavers. The garden lights were on. Amber warm along the hedges. The roses trimmed clean. The walkway swept. Nothing looked disturbed. A picture-perfect estate sitting above the Atlantic. Exactly as it always appeared from the outside. But Selim ran the Atlantic Syndicate. He had understood before he turned 30 that the outside of anything is almost never the truth. That was not cynicism. That was just the cost of paying attention long enough. Every clean surface he had ever encountered in his life had something underneath it. Every quiet house had a different temperature than it showed. He scanned the garden once. The perimeter camera above the left hedge was angled 2 degrees off from where it was set this morning. Small. The kind of thing most people would never catch. He caught it immediately. The main entrance was unlocked. He pushed through. Foyer dim. One light burning above the staircase, throwing everything below it into long shadow. The 2-man interior post, gone. The monitoring station to the left of the entry. Screen dark, chair empty. A coffee mug still releasing a thin curl of steam from whatever was left inside. Recent. Whoever left that chair left it fast. He stood in the center of the foyer and listened. This house had its own particular sound. The low hum of climate control in the walls, the distant push of ocean against the cliff face hundreds of feet below, the occasional creak of the upper hallway when wind pressed against the north-facing windows. He had memorized every note of this building the way a man memorizes the face of someone he loves. Automatic. Unconscious. Tonight, the notes were wrong. He moved through the main corridor without turning on additional lights. Past the library with its double doors pulled half shut. Past the formal dining room. 16 chairs empty around the long table. The overhead chandelier dark. Past the staff kitchen where the overhead was still on and a cutting board sat out with no food on it. Just a knife placed neatly on the wood and nothing else. The knife was facing the wrong direction for someone who was cooking. Whoever left that knife behind was not thinking about cooking. Soren's studio was dark. He checked it anyway, pushed the door open slowly, let his eyes adjust to the ambient light coming in from the windows. The drafting table was clear. Sketchbooks stacked in order along the left edge. A half-finished charcoal piece pinned to the upright board. The Atlantic in full storm. Waves rendered in thick diagonal lines and deep shadow. Soren's work was always weather. Always motion caught at the second before it broke apart. He wasn't here. Selim turned back toward the main hall. That was when he noticed the upper corridor light. Just one. The far end of the upper hallway, barely visible from the base of the staircase. Soft and gold and absolutely still, like it was trying very hard not to draw attention to itself. The nursery. He moved toward the staircase and stopped at the bottom step. Placed one hand on the banister. Didn't move. The nursery door was open. That room stayed closed. Always. It was the one unspoken rule of the entire mansion. Not written, not announced, but understood by every person who worked here. That door closed. Soren kept it closed. had kept it closed for 3 years without a single exception, and Selim had never pushed it because some doors, he understood, were not his to open. The light inside was low and gold. He started up the stairs. He stopped 4 feet from the doorway, close enough to see, far enough to stay completely invisible in the dark stretch of hallway behind him. What was inside that room did not make immediate sense. Soren was on the floor, both knees down, body folded slightly forward, not collapsed, not in pain but positioned, set, like someone who had lowered themselves into that posture deliberately and meant every inch of it. That alone stopped Selim's breathing. Soren Vale did not kneel. Not for anyone in this house. Not for Selim himself, not for syndicate ceremony. Not for the formal Omega customs that every outside function quietly pressed on them. In 5 years of marriage, 5 years of events and alliances and the suffocating social architecture of the Omegaverse's most powerful families, Soren had never once lowered himself in deference to anyone. That had never been asked of him. Selim had made sure of that. So why here? Why now? Why in a room that no one else was supposed to be inside? Selim's eyes moved left. Dario Kess stood inside the room. He placed the face immediately. Dario Kess, Beta, late 30s, consigliere rank within the Voss operation. A rival house with deep roots in Atlantic shipping lanes. He had no business in this city. He had no business within 10 miles of this property. And yet there he stood, close enough to Soren that the distance between them registered as intimate whether it was designed to or not. His hands were moving, not reaching, not touching, signing. The tightening in Selim's jaw happened so slowly he barely felt it begin. He recognized sign language. He had spent 2 years learning it after he married Soren. Hired a private instructor, sat for 18 months, practiced alone until the language stopped feeling like memorization and started feeling like thought. He had wanted to speak to his husband in Soren's own language. He had wanted that channel to belong to both of them. He recognized the shapes Dario was making, but not what they meant. That was the thing that locked him in place. Not the presence of another man. Not the proximity. The fact that the hands moving in front of him spoke a dialect he had never been taught. The signs were built from familiar foundations, the base structures Selim knew, but layered with compressions and combinations assembled differently. Folded into each other, fluid and compressed in ways that suggested not just fluency but deep intimacy with the form. Like a version of the language that lived underneath the version Selim had been given. Soren responded, both hands moving. No pause between Dario finishing and Soren beginning. The conversation had its own current, its own speed, and neither of them was performing for anyone. Dario signed back without needing to think. Which meant this was not new. This was practiced. This had been going on long enough that the exchange required no effort from either of them. Selim pressed one shoulder flat against the hallway wall and made himself absolutely still. He was aware of his own pulse. The roses were still in his left hand. 12 stems, deep red, bought at a market near the DC airfield 2 hours before his flight. He had felt something close to nervous buying them. He set them quietly on the hallway floor against the baseboard. And he watched. Soren's expression was not the expression of someone afraid of being seen. No tension across the forehead. No sideways checks toward the door. No awareness of the open hallway behind Dario's shoulder. What Selim saw in his husband's face was something he had only ever seen in the studio, that particular quality of focus that appeared when a piece of art was finally resolving the way it had always been meant to. Concentrated. Present. This conversation belonged to Soren. Dario completed a long sequence. Soren's chin dropped once. Quick. Agreement. Then Soren signed back. Both hands. Long. The kind of sentence that carries weight. Selim tracked every shape from the first sign to the last. He understood approximately half of his husband's language. He pulled back from the doorway one step at a time. Down the hallway. Down the stairs. Out the front door. The wind hit him. He stood on the stone path with the Atlantic somewhere below the cliff and one thought moving through everything else. He didn't understand them. They hadn't known he was there. There was a language inside his marriage that he had never been allowed into, and someone else had. He drove north. No direction beyond that. No destination. Just the coastal road and the headlights cutting through the dark and the ocean visible in bursts when the road curved right and the cliff edge opened up and the water caught what little the sky was offering. He drove for almost an hour before he stopped. Pulled onto a gravel shoulder above a stretch of empty beach. Cut the engine. Sat with both hands still on the wheel for a moment longer than necessary. Then set them in his lap and let the silence come in. Here is what Selim Driven did not do. He did not drive back. He did not walk into that nursery and remove Dario Kes from the floor of his own home with the level of force that 3 decades of syndicate authority had made automatic. He did not take Soren by both arms and demand an explanation in the middle of a conversation he had no full translation for. He did not move on incomplete information. That rule had saved him more than once. It had also cost him things he could not name cleanly, but the saving had outweighed the cost in every column that mattered, and so the rule stayed. So he sat on the gravel shoulder and he thought. First, Dario Kes was not a romantic threat. He ran that scenario completely in the first 15 minutes, examined it from every angle, gave it full consideration, and set it down. Not because Soren was incapable of wanting something that had nothing to do with Selim. That was not a comfortable thought, but it was an honest one, and he had never operated well on dishonesty. He set it down because what he had seen in that room had none of the texture of concealment. No charged energy pulled tight under a surface. No awareness of time. No 2 people managing the weight of something hidden. 2 people working. That was what it looked like. Which meant the question was not who. It was what, and what opened a different kind of door entirely. He thought about learning to sign. He had been 23. New husband, new responsibility. He had hired Dr. Priyankosi, 50 years old. No interest in praise. With the directness of someone who had spent decades working with people for whom communication was not a performance but a lifeline. She had taught him for 18 months. The morning Soren first responded to him in full flowing sentences. Not short practiced phrases but actual conversation. Ideas going back and forth in a language that had no sound. Selim had felt something he had not expected. Pride. Gratitude. The specific weight of having earned something real. He had believed that language was theirs. He understood something now, sitting on that gravel shoulder, that he had not let himself consider before. He had learned Soren's language because he wanted in. He had told himself it was love, effort, proof, the thing that separated him from every alpha who had ever treated an omega as property to be managed rather than a person to be heard. Maybe it was all of those things, but it was also control. Quiet and clean and self-justifying, but control. He had wanted to understand Soren so completely that Soren could not exist in a single space that Selim couldn't follow. The thought sat badly. He let it sit anyway. He pulled out his phone and pressed a contact listed only by last name. 2 rings. I need a full audit, he said when the line opened. Financial, legal, access logs. Everything connected to the Sorenvale household accounts and anything adjacent to Voss House operations in Atlantic territory. Full trace. Nothing flagged publicly. 24 hours. A beat of silence. Then, understood. He ended the call. Sat for another 10 minutes looking at the dark water below. When he drove back, the front gate was closed and the house was dark except for the upper studio window. A single lamp. And Soren's silhouette at the drafting table, standing, working back to the window, moving a hand across whatever piece he had started. Like nothing had happened. Like the evening had been entirely ordinary. Selim sat in the driveway for a long moment with the engine off and looked at that lit window and did not go inside. He had set roses on a hallway floor tonight and walked out of his own house without saying a single word. Tomorrow the audit would begin returning results. He would wait. He would watch. He would build a complete picture before he moved a single piece on the board. And when he finally moved, he would move exactly right. Whatever was happening in this house, it had been building for a long time. long enough that whoever built it was not afraid of being found. That was the part that stayed with him as he finally cut the headlights and went inside. 3 weeks. Selim gave it 3 full weeks before he admitted to himself that the patterns were real and not just the shape of his own suspicion filling in gaps that weren't there. The first week he had kept dinner quiet and watched. Soren's routine had shifted. Earlier mornings, longer hours in the East Wing office that had been used primarily for storage since they moved into the property 2 years after the bonding. That office was now lit past midnight 3 times in 7 days. Selim noted it, kept his expression neutral across the table and said nothing. Week 2, the audit results began arriving on his private server. He read them at night, door locked, going through line items the way a surgeon reads a scan. Methodical, without expression, looking for the one detail that would explain the pattern around it. What he found was not what he had prepared himself for. Dario Kes had no history of prior entry to the estate. The visit Selim had witnessed appeared to be the only one on record. No security footage of additional arrivals, no vehicle logs, no staff movement reports that placed him on the property before or after. One visit. Clean entry, clean exit, no trail that suggested repetition. That was not the behavior of someone carrying on a private arrangement. That was the behavior of someone completing a specific planned exchange. A handoff. One meeting that had been worked toward and then finished. Week 3, Selim began watching Soren the way he watched everything he needed to understand fully. Not from the front, where the subject could see him adjusting, but from the edges. Peripheral. Patient. And what he saw over those 7 days settled something in his chest that he had not expected. Soren was calmer. Not the tight, managed calm of someone running from a mistake. Not the performance of someone maintaining a cover. This was different. This was the ease of a person who had made a decision and was now living inside it without the friction of uncertainty. Like a room that had been rearranged and was finally where it was supposed to be. It should have been reassuring. It wasn't. Because along with the calm came distance. Not hostility. Not coldness. Just a new few inches of space at the dinner table that had not existed before. A small shift in how Soren looked at him when he spoke. Still attentive, still processing every word, but with something running underneath the attention now. An ongoing evaluation. Like Soren was taking quiet measure of him on a continuous basis and adding the results to something Selim couldn't see. Selim kept eating. Kept talking about the DC logistics contract and the northern route delays and the quarterly review that was running 2 weeks behind. Kept his face exactly where it needed to be. On day 19, a detail surfaced in the financial trace that changed the shape of everything. Dario Kes held clearance on a subsidiary registered under the Dreven Holdings legal framework. Atlantic Bridge Consulting, LLC. Small on paper. Clean. Registered 3 years ago during a period of rapid expansion when Selim had been approving 12 documents a day and relying on his legal team to catch the things that needed catching. They had not caught this one. Atlantic Bridge had accumulated access over 18 months to 4 restricted internal databases. Staff communication records from the Trafficking Oversight Division. Medical intake logs from the syndicate's legal clinic network. Silent witness protection routing files. And one additional category that made Selim set the paper down and look at the far wall for 60 full seconds before picking it back up. Relocation records. Sealed. Classified at the highest internal tier. The files that moved people who needed to disappear entirely. Protected witnesses, trafficking survivors, operatives whose covers had been burned. The people the syndicate sheltered when every official system had already failed them. Dario had gotten into those files. Not through standard administrative process. Through a back channel. A custom-built access corridor that had been constructed quietly, over time, without authorization from any throne-level officer. Selim followed the origin point of that channel through 4 layers of nested accounts. It traced back to the Soren Vale household legal infrastructure. The accounts established at the time of their bonding. The accounts Selim had assumed were standard financial instruments tied to the marriage covenant. Soren had not been handed access to those accounts. He had built a door into them before their first year together was finished. Before the bonding ink was dry, Soren Vale had created a passage into the Dreven legal architecture. And for 4 years, nobody had seen it. Selim closed the report. He sat in the dark of his office for a long time, both hands flat on the desk, looking at nothing. Then he stood, put on his jacket, and went looking for his husband. He found Soren in the kitchen. Not the studio, not the East Wing office. The kitchen, standing at the counter with a glass of water and a book open flat beside it. Reading in the late-night quiet he always kept to himself before bed. The overhead was low. The window above the sink showed nothing but black sky and the very faint line where the cliff edge met darkness. Selim walked in and did not rush, did not slam anything, did not let his voice get ahead of him. He crossed the floor and stopped on the opposite side of the counter and set both hands flat on the surface between them and waited until Soren looked up. Soren read his face, set the book aside. Who taught Dario Kes your dialect? The question went into the room and stayed there. Soren didn't move immediately. He watched Selim for a moment with that particular stillness he carried. The one that people who didn't know him often mistook for blankness and people who did know him recognized as full attention. Then his hands came up. He signed, "Why does the teacher matter?" "Because I didn't know it was being taught." Selim kept his voice level and steady. "Because I spent 2 years learning a language I believed was ours, that I was told existed between the two of us and no one else. And what I watched in that nursery 3 weeks ago was a conversation I could not fully follow in my own house." Soren's hands moved. "You learned what I gave you access to." The words landed somewhere Selim was not prepared for. He kept his face still. Let a beat of silence pass. "What does that mean?" Soren didn't repeat it. He let it stay on the table exactly as it had been placed, unhurried, undefended, and waited. And that was where Selim made the mistake. He knew it the moment the words came out. The wrong question, the one that moved the conversation onto ground that couldn't hold both of them. He should have asked about Atlantic Bridge Consulting, about the access channels and the relocation records and 4 years of careful invisible construction inside the legal frame of their marriage. That was the real question. Instead he said, "You chose him. Whatever this is. You chose someone outside this house to be part of it. You decided I didn't belong in it." Soren's jaw moved once. Barely. Not guilt. Something that looked a great deal like the specific frustration of a person who has been misunderstood precisely when it mattered most. His hands came up. Faster this time, the movements sharp and deliberate and carrying weight. "I chose the work. You were never excluded. You were evaluated." Selim went quiet. "Evaluated," he said. "Yes. By you. By what you protect." He looked at Soren. Looked at the stillness of him, the absolute lack of apology in the way he stood holding that space, not moving toward Selim and not retreating from him either. "I protect this family," Selim said. "Careful. Controlled. I protect every person inside this house and every operation connected to it. That has always been." Soren's hands cut in before the sentence could close. One sign. Single. Definitive. Throne. A pause. Then, "You protect the throne." The kitchen held onto that. Selim did not respond immediately. He looked at his husband, this man who had stood at 30 syndicate functions in the last 5 years and been dismissed by every board member, every rival house representative, every visiting alpha who had come to assess the Dreven holdings. Dismissed as decoration, as gesture, as the Omega kept at the king's side because the bloodline mechanics of their world required it. This man who had spent 4 years building a structure inside Selim's own legal house that Selim had not found until 3 weeks ago. "This conversation is not finished," Selim said. Soren picked up his book. And then, without looking up, without ceremony, he signed one last sentence. Long. Both hands moving through a full sequence. Selim tracked it from the first position to the last with everything he had. He caught the opening clearly. He caught the final word. The middle. 6, maybe 7 signs compressed into that layered dialect. Passed through him without translation. Gone. Inaccessible. Like a door that had never been opened for him. Soren walked out of the kitchen. Selim stayed at the counter and did not move. He had just been told something that mattered. Something the shape of the entire evening, the access files, the audit trail, the 4 years of careful invisible work, had been building toward. He did not know what it was. 6 signs. Maybe 7. Right there in front of him, in his own kitchen, directed at him. And he had stood there and watched every word pass through the air like water through a closed fist. He didn't know what his husband had just told him. He could feel the weight of that. The way you feel a door close in a room you're still standing in. He didn't move for a long time. The subsidiary had 41 employees. 41 people drawing salaries from a company Selim had signed into existence during a 12-minute legal review 3 years ago. A company called Atlantic Bridge Consulting, LLC, which appeared in his holdings portfolio between 2 other shell entities and had never once triggered an alert, a flag, or a single question from any member of his compliance team. 41 people. And not one of them had ever been interviewed by anyone in Selim's inner circle. He sat in the back office of the syndicate's waterfront building at 7 in the morning with the full Atlantic Bridge file spread across the desk in front of him. Printed, physical, not digital, and worked through it the way he worked through everything that mattered. Slowly, without skipping, cover to cover, every name, every transaction record, every routing detail traced back to its origin point. Nobody else was in the building yet. He had come before the cleaning crew. Before the overnight security shift changeover. He had wanted this room to himself, this material in his hands alone, before any other eyes were near it. The first thing he confirmed was the access structure Dario Kes had used. 3 years ago, Atlantic Bridge had been quietly embedded into the legal infrastructure of 4 driven subsidiaries. Not given administrative access, something more precise than that. Reading access to specific file categories. Carefully scoped. Narrow enough that no single access log showed anything alarming in isolation. That was intentional. Someone had known exactly how wide to open each door. The second thing he confirmed was the work itself. Atlantic Bridge Consulting was not a shell. It was operational. It ran a silent communication network, secure, encrypted, designed specifically for people who could not communicate verbally. Trafficking survivors. Protected witnesses. People in transit between syndicate safe houses who needed to relay information without using voice calls that could be intercepted. Pause on that. A real operation. Inside his holdings. Running for 31 months without his knowledge. The third thing he found was the funding trail. He followed it back through 4 layered transfers, each one moving through a different subsidiary, each one documented as a standard internal allocation. Until it terminated at an account established 3 years ago. The account was under Soren Vale's legal name. Selim set the page down. He picked up the next one. The initiative had a name. Not a corporate name. A working name used only in internal communications, documents signed with initials rather than full names, memos that referenced the program as simply the bridge. 31 months of memos. Meeting notes. Case logs. Each case reduced to a number. No identifying information, just status updates and outcome notations. He read the outcome notations. Relocated, 47. Stabilized, 112. Active support, 29. He read those numbers twice. Then a third time, 188 people. Not transactions. People who had moved through this program and come out somewhere safer than where they started. Because someone had built an infrastructure for them inside the Atlantic Syndicate's legal architecture without asking anyone's permission. Without asking for resources. Without asking for acknowledgement from anyone holding a throne. And Selim had been signing invoices 3 floors above it for 3 years without knowing they existed. Without asking for permission. That phrase kept coming back. He leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. The initiative was not just running. It was embedded. It had legal standing, operational continuity, funding mechanisms, staff, case management protocols. It was not something that could be shut down by removing one person. It had been built specifically so that no single removal could stop it. Whoever designed this had thought about the moment Selim found it, and had built it to survive that moment. He picked up his phone, called his legal director. 3 rings. "I need an assessment," he said when the line opened. "Atlantic Bridge Consulting. I want to know how deep the legal integration goes and what it would take to restructure it without public exposure." A pause. "Longer than it should have been. Sir, that assessment may take several days. The integration it's fairly complex." Fairly complex. That was the most careful answer his legal director had ever given him. Selim ended the call and looked back at the case log on the desk. 188 people. And the program was already too deep in the walls of his own empire to pull out quietly. That was the moment something shifted. Not his position on this, not yet, but the angle from which he was looking at it. He had been asking who built this and why they hadn't told him. He needed to start asking something else entirely. Why had Soren been so certain enough to spend 3 years building in secret, that telling him would have changed everything? That Selim would have reached for legal exposure and political risk before he reached for the people. That the man he married would have found every reason to delay. Whether or not that belief was right, that was the question that required sitting with. Not the program. The belief behind why it had been hidden from him in the first place. The balcony door was already open when Selim stepped outside. 6:43 in the evening. The sun still up but barely committed to it. Low and flat, burning orange across the Atlantic like it was deciding whether to stay. Soren was at the railing, both hands resting on the stone ledge, face toward the water, the kind of stillness that was not rest. It was waiting. Like he had known Selim was coming up here and had decided to simply stand in the open and let whatever was arriving come to him on its own terms. The sun was low, orange cutting flat across the water. The wind was easier than it had been all week. Still present, still cold, but not fighting anything. Selim stopped 2 feet behind him. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Selim said, "You undermined this house." Flat. Measured. Not a shout. Those were always easier to dismiss. Soren turned. Faced him. His expression was not defensive and it was not sorry. It was the expression of someone who had expected exactly this conversation and had already decided where they stood inside it. His hands lifted. He signed, "I built inside this house. There is a difference. There is no difference when you do it without authorization from the throne." Soren finished the sentence before Selim could. The word hung between them. Selim held it. "From me. The authorization should have come from me. I am the head of this." Soren's hands moved again, steady and unhurried. "You would have protected the legal exposure first, then the political risk, then the optics, and somewhere at the bottom of that list. If the list was long enough, you might have gotten to the people. That is not. It is exactly. You don't know what I would have done." Soren looked at him. Just looked. Not with contempt. Not with anger. With something far harder to sit across from. Complete, quiet certainty. "I know what you protect," he signed. "I watched you protect it for 5 years." The wind moved through the space between them. Selim turned and looked out at the water. He needed a second. He was not accustomed to needing seconds in conversations. He ran negotiations that lasted 4 days without losing his footing once. He had sat across from men who wanted to end his life and held perfectly still. Soren made him need a second. 188 people, Selim said. He didn't look back yet. "That's what the case log shows." "Yes. And you were leading it." Soren's reflection was visible in the glass panel beside the railing. He watched it instead of turning. Soren's hands. "I have been leading it since the 2nd year of this marriage." 2nd year. 3 years ago, when Selim had still believed the most intimate thing they shared was a private sign language. "Why Dario?" Selim said. The Voss House had existing infrastructure in 4 port cities. Soren signed it matter-of-factly, like a project director giving a status update. Dario had connections to intake networks we couldn't build from this house without drawing attention. He came to me. I evaluated him for 8 months before I gave him access. You evaluated him? Yes. For 8 months? Yes. Selim turned back, looked at Soren directly. You ran a background and trust assessment on a rival house consigliere inside my legal infrastructure for 8 months without telling me. Soren held his gaze. Without apology. Yes. Selim let that land. Really let it land, without rushing past it the way he rushed past things that were uncomfortable. 8 months. Soren had evaluated that man the way Selim evaluated acquisitions. Methodically, over time, with criteria Selim had never been shown, using judgment Selim had never been asked to weigh in on. In his own house, with his own legal infrastructure as the operating ground. He realized, standing on that balcony, that he had spent 5 years thinking of Soren's silence as a kind of waiting, as if the stillness of someone who did not speak was the stillness of someone who had nothing to say. That assumption had been wrong from the beginning. The silence had never been empty. It had been full, occupied, working, and Selim had looked at it every day across a dinner table and seen what he wanted to see instead of what was actually there. It was closer to the feeling of standing in a room you thought you knew completely and finding a door in a wall that had always been there. Finding it had been there the whole time. You expected me to find this eventually, Selim said. Soren's hands rose one more time, slow. Deliberate. I expected it to be ready when you did. Selim did not answer that. He stood on the balcony as the sun dropped below the water and thought about what it meant to spend 5 years building something strong enough to survive the man who lived in the same house, and to do it quietly, without permission, without apology, without ever once asking to be stopped. He started with Mercer Vale. Not because Vale was the most dangerous name on the list. He wasn't. He was mid-level, a board seat, legacy inheritance, 0 operational value and maximum institutional protection. The kind of person who had been in the room for 30 years without anyone asking too hard what he actually did there. That was exactly why Selim started with him. No spectacle, no confrontation, no meeting where Vale could read the room and manage his exit. Just a Tuesday morning when Vale arrived at the Dreven Holdings boardroom and his access card didn't work. His assistant received a single email, formal, legal, complete, informing him of the restructuring. His benefits package was intact. His NDA was updated. His chair was gone. Gone. That was it. That was all of it. 3 days later, a holding company connected to Vale's personal accounts was quietly flagged in an internal compliance review. The flag would sit in a file. It would go nowhere as long as Vale stayed gone and stayed quiet. Selim was not threatening anyone. He was simply making the math very clear. The second removal was Deacon Pruitt. Senior legal counsel, 15 years, architect of several of the shell structures that had been used to route money away from the Trafficking Oversight Division for the past 6 years. Pruitt took slightly longer, a week and a half. His removal required a court filing, a confidentiality agreement, and one quiet conversation between his personal attorney and Selim's that lasted 40 minutes and ended with a handshake that nobody photographed. The third was a name Selim had known for 20 years. A man who had been at his father's right hand before he was at Selim's. Older, respected, the kind of person whose removal would be noticed. His name was Aldous Greer. Greer had been inside the Atlantic Syndicate since before Selim inherited it. He was not a criminal in the way that word gets used carelessly. He had never personally moved product or touched a transaction he couldn't defend in court. But he was the reason certain conversations never reached Selim's desk. Every reform proposal that had died in committee, every intake network expansion that had been quietly defunded, every disability access request that had been tabled, Greer was the hand that moved those things off the table. Quietly, over years, without fingerprints. His removal took 3 weeks. A board vote, framed as routine governance. No accusation. No public statement. 9 to 4. Filed without press. Greer was gone. Selim had the 9 votes because of relationships he had spent a decade building so that moments like this would not require force. That was a different kind of power than the kind he had grown up watching. Slower, less visible, but it had held. The cost was not the votes. The cost was that 3 of those 9 votes had already started asking questions. Not about the removals themselves, the removals were clean and defensible. About the pattern. 3 board members, separately and within 48 hours of each other, had flagged that the restructuring was moving unusually fast across unusually specific sectors. Compliance, legal, trafficking oversight. It was Selim's director of operations, Jemison Hale, 20 years in, unshakable, not a man who alarmed easily, who brought it to him directly. He did not call ahead. He did not schedule a meeting. He walked in at 3 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, set a single printed page on Selim's desk, and left the room without sitting down or saying anything beyond, "It's not going unnoticed." That was all. Selim looked at the page. 3 names. Question marks beside each one. A timeline of the removals plotted out in clean columns with dates and board meeting records cross-referenced. Someone had built this. Someone with access to the right internal systems and the pattern recognition to see what was happening before it finished happening. Whoever they were not panicking. The document was too clean for panic. It read like preparation, like someone gathering evidence they might need later. Someone was watching. Not Soren. Not Dario. Someone inside the board structure had started mapping what Selim was doing and had gotten close enough to the real shape of it that the map was nearly accurate. Selim read the page twice, set it face down. Then he sat with it for a moment. Whoever built that document had not yet moved on it. It was a watch, not a weapon, which meant he still had time, but not much. Once someone started mapping or restructuring this carefully, the window between observation and action was never wide. He thought about what Soren had said on the balcony. "I built this so that you would eventually have to look at it and choose." He had chosen. He was still choosing. The choosing was not finished. He picked up his phone and started the 4th removal. This one would be the most visible yet. A name that would register inside the broader syndicate network when it disappeared. A name that would tell certain people that Selim Driven was not adjusting the ship. He was changing its course entirely. He pressed call. He did not hesitate. It was past midnight when Selim walked into the studio. The lamp on the corner table was on. Soren was at the drafting table, not working, not in the way he usually worked. He was sitting with his arms folded on the surface and his head down, the way a person sits when the work is done and the quiet afterward has too much weight in it. He heard Selim come in, lifted his head, did not move otherwise. Selim pulled a chair from against the wall and set it 2 feet from the table and sat down in it. Not standing over him, not across the room, at the same level, same floor. He said, "I'm afraid." Soren went still. Not the waiting stillness. Something different. Something that was actually listening. "Not of losing you," Selim said. He kept his eyes level, his voice low. "Not of the program or Dario or the board restructuring. I've been afraid of those things in the way you're afraid of problems, which means you assess them and move. That's manageable." He paused. "What I'm afraid of is being irrelevant. To you. To what you're building. I've been running this syndicate since I was 26 and I have never once, not once, sat at a table where I was the person who didn't already know the most important thing in the room." He stopped there. Soren's hands came up slowly. "I never wanted your permission," he signed. "I want you to understand that. I was not waiting for you to approve this. I was waiting to see if you were the kind of man who could live with what I did without needing to be the one who started it." And Soren held the question for a moment. Then, still deciding, Selim absorbed that. It should have been worse than it was. In any other conversation with any other person, that answer would have landed as insult. Coming from Soren. Sitting in the lamplight of a studio full of work that had never once asked for an audience, it landed as honesty. Clean and undiluted and without performance. "I love you," Selim said. He said it plainly, the way you say something that doesn't need decoration. I want to be clear that I know that about myself. Whatever this is between us right now, whatever the next 6 months look like while we rebuild what you built and I take apart what I have to take apart. I am not unclear about that part. Soren looked at him. His expression shifted in a way it rarely shifted in front of anyone. Something below the surface moved. Not softness exactly, Soren did not do softness in the way it is usually offered. But recognition. The particular recognition of someone who has been seen in full without reduction and is deciding what to do with it. I never wanted permission, he signed again. But I wanted you to find it. This matters. I built this so that you would eventually have to look at it and choose. Choose what? The throne. Or the people who need the bridge to exist. Selim was quiet for a long time. Outside, the Atlantic was doing what it always did. Pushing against the cliff, pulling back, pushing again. Indifferent. Ongoing. Older than all of it. Those two things are not incompatible, Selim finally said. Soren tilted his head. A fraction. 1 degree. The Soren equivalent of a raised eyebrow. Selim met it. They are not. And I am going to spend the next year proving that. Without asking you to slow down. Soren's hands stayed still for a moment. Then he signed one word. Okay, just that. One word. No ceremony. Selim stood up. Pushed the chair back against the wall. Moved toward the door. He stopped before he reached it. Did not turn around. I won't interfere with the program. I want you to know that. Whatever Dario needs, whatever the bridge needs, I will not stand in front of it. The room was very quiet behind him. He heard Soren move, heard the soft scrape of the chair, heard footsteps cross the studio floor, and then Soren stepped in front of him. Not behind, in front, between Selim and the door. He looked at Selim for a moment, long, direct, reading everything the way he always read everything. And then his hands came up one final time. He signed something Selim had never seen before. New. Deliberate. Built from pieces of the private dialect and pieces of the shared one. A sentence assembled from both worlds at once. Selim understood every word. Every single one. And for the first time in this entire reckoning, he did not know what to do with what had just been said to him. 6 months later. The cliff balcony again. The same railing. The same ocean, the same wind that had no patience and no direction and no interest in what was happening to the people who stood above it. Selim was alone. He had been standing here for 20 minutes before he heard the balcony door open behind him. He did not turn around. He already knew the sound of Soren's footsteps, had known them for 5 years, could place them in any room of any size without looking. Soren came to the railing, stood beside him. Not touching, not speaking, just present the way he had always been present, without announcement, without requirement. The Atlantic Bridge program had been formally integrated into the Dreven Holdings legal structure 4 months ago. Not hidden, not buried in a subsidiary, fully acknowledged. On the record, with Selim's signature on the restructuring agreement and Soren's name listed as Director of Operations, which was simply the title that matched what Soren had already been doing for 3 years without needing it. Mercer Vale was gone. Deacon Pruitt was gone. Aldous Greer was gone. 3 additional names had followed, quiet removals, clean exits, no spectacle. The board had stabilized. Hale had stopped bringing Selim printed pages with question marks on them. The program had expanded. 47 active cases last month. The Silent Communication Network had been integrated into 2 additional Port City operations. Dario Kess held a formal consulting contract now, reviewed, authorized on paper with Selim's legal team involved at every step. All of it visible. All of it documented. None of it in the dark anymore. And yet, Selim looked out at the water. Here is the thing about doing the right thing quietly. Nobody announces it like a victory. There is no moment where the music swells and the room acknowledges what happened. You just wake up one morning and the architecture is different and the work continues and the people it was built for don't know your name and don't need to. That was what justice actually looked like, it turned out. Not a confrontation. Not a reckoning with cameras. Just a long series of correct decisions made in private rooms, one after another, until the structure they built was something that could stand without you. He had thought power was the ability to stop things. He was standing on a balcony above the Atlantic next to a man who had spent 3 years building something unstoppable, and the only reason it had survived was because it had been built to survive Selim specifically. That was not a comfortable thing to understand about yourself. But it was true, and he had run out of use for comfortable untruths. Not a full sentence. Just a single sign. One Selim recognized immediately from the private dialect. One he had learned in the studio that night 6 months ago when Soren had stepped in front of the door and handed him something neither of them had a name for yet. The sign meant, "Still here." Selim kept looking at the water. "I know," he said. They stood there together on the cliff above the Atlantic as the light dropped and the wind picked up and the ocean did what it had always done. Indifferent, ongoing, older than all of it. The program would keep running. The restructuring would hold. The people who had been moved safely through the bridge would continue building lives somewhere that wasn't the place they'd been taken from. Soren would keep leading it. Selim would keep the empire that made it possible. And whatever they were to each other now, after all of it, after the audit and the confrontation and the kitchen and the balcony and the studio at midnight, it was not what they had been before. Not smaller. Not simpler. Something harder to define. Something that required both of them to stay in the room and keep choosing it, every day, without the safety net of innocence or the comfort of easy answers. Selim finally turned to look at Soren. Soren was already looking at him. Neither of them moved. And the question that had hung over all of it, the one that had no clean answer and had never pretended to, settled into the space between them and stayed there. Was this the beginning of something equal? Or was it the slow, patient reshaping of a king by the one person who had never needed his permission to begin? If the story moved something in you, if you recognized that kind of quiet strength, that kind of love that refuses to ask for approval, share it. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else out there needs to hear today. And if you want to be here for the next story, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Every story we tell here is built to make you feel something real. Don't miss what's coming. The next one starts somewhere unexpected. It always does.